March 14, 1945. Kasumigaura Naval Air Arsenal, 40 miles northeast of Tokyo. The morning air carries the acrid smell of burnt oil and metal shavings. Inside Hangar 7, a team of Imperial Japanese Navy engineers stands in a semicircle around something that shouldn't exist on Japanese soil, a captured North American P-51D Mustang, its aluminum skin gleaming under the harsh electric lights like a silver ghost from another world. The aircraft had been forced down over Iwo Jima 3 weeks earlier, its young American pilot captured before he could destroy his machine. Now it sits here intact, a prize of war in a puzzle wrapped in riveted metal. Lead engineer Commander Takeshi Nakamura circles the aircraft slowly, his hand trailing along the fuselage, feeling the precision of American manufacturing beneath his fingertips. The workshop falls silent, except for the distant rumble of B-29s. Passing overhead, a sound that has become the soundtrack to Japan's waking nightmare. Nakamura had spent 15 years designing aircraft. He had studied at the Imperial University, had worked on the Zero, had believed in Japanese engineering supremacy with the fervor of a true patriot. But standing before this American fighter, he feels something he has never felt before in his professional life. Genuine awe mixed with a creeping sense of dread. The Mustang is not just a machine, it is a statement. Every rivet, every aluminum panel, every carefully machined component speaks of an industrial capacity that Japan cannot match, has never matched, and he suspects in the quiet places of his mind he dare not voice will never match. The assignment given to him by Naval High Command is simple in words, impossible in reality. Reverse engineer this aircraft, understand its secrets, and build Japanese versions capable of defending the home islands from the American bombers that now darken the skies with impunity. He has 6 months. Japan has perhaps less. The Mustang represents the culmination of American aviation engineering, a fighter that has rewritten the rules of air combat over Europe and the Pacific. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine produces 1,800 horsepower, driving the aircraft to speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour at altitude. Its range exceeds 1,700 miles with external tanks, allowing it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and return home. But these are just numbers. What Nakamura sees before him is something more fundamental, evidence of an industrial philosophy entirely alien to Japanese manufacturing. The Americans have built this aircraft with the assumption of abundance. Every system has redundancy. Every component is machined to tolerances that seem almost wasteful in their precision. The cockpit contains instruments that Japanese fighters would consider luxuries: artificial horizon, radio compass, multiple fuel gauges, hydraulic controls that make the aircraft respond to the pilot's touch like a living thing. This is not an aircraft built by a nation conserving resources. This is an aircraft built by a nation that assumes it will never run out of anything. The Second World War had revealed a fundamental truth about modern conflict that military theorists had suspected but never fully understood until it was too late. Industrial capacity matters more than warrior spirit. Japan had entered the war with arguably the world's most experienced naval aviators, men who had honed their skills over China, pilots who could coax miracles from their lightweight, maneuverable Zeros. The Zero had terrorized Allied forces in the early months of the Pacific War, outturning, outclimbing, and outranging anything the Americans or British could put in the air. Japanese pilots had believed themselves invincible, their aircraft superior, their cause blessed by the gods. But the Americans had learned. More importantly, they had built. For every Zero Japan manufactured, America produced 10 fighters. For every Japanese pilot lost in combat, America trained 20 replacements. The war had become an equation, and Japan was on the wrong side of the mathematics. By 1945, that equation had become catastrophic. American Hellcats and Corsairs dominated the Pacific skies. B-29. Superfortresses flew over Japan at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach, dropping incendiaries that turned wooden cities into infernos. And now the Mustangs had arrived. Long-range fighters that could escort the bombers all the way from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back, swatting aside the desperate attacks of Japanese interceptors like a man brushing away insects. The Japanese High Command had watched this transformation with growing desperation. If they could not defeat American air superiority, they could not defend the home islands. If they could not defend the home islands, invasion was inevitable. And so the order had come down. Study the Mustang, learn its secrets, copy its capabilities. Build Japanese Mustangs, save the empire. Nakamura had assembled the best team available: 15 engineers, 7 mechanics, 3 metallurgists, 2 engine specialists. They were brilliant men, educated, experienced, devoted to their nation. They began their work with systematic precision, photographing every inch of the Mustang, measuring every component, creating detailed technical drawings. They removed the engine cowling and stared at the Merlin engine as though it were an artifact from an advanced civilization, which in many ways it was. The engine alone represented manufacturing capabilities beyond Japanese reach. Its supercharger was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, allowing the engine to maintain power at altitudes where Japanese engines gasped for air. Its fuel injection system delivered precise mixtures under all flight conditions. Its construction required alloys and machining tolerances that Japanese factories, starved of chromium and nickel and cobalt, could not reliably produce. But it was not the engine that broke Nakamura's spirit. It was the fuel. The Mustang's operational manual, captured with the aircraft, specified fuel requirements with bureaucratic precision. ANF-28 specification fuel, commonly known as 100-octane aviation gasoline, or in later production, 100R30 grade fuel with performance number ratings that indicated even higher performance under supercharged conditions. To the American pilot, this was simply fuel, something that existed at every airfield, pumped from underground tanks that seemed never to run empty, refined from Texas and California oil fields that produced petroleum in quantities that seemed infinite. To Nakamura, reading these specifications in the dim light of his office at 2 a.m, these numbers represented the unbridgeable gap between Japanese capability and American reality. Japan, in early 1945, could barely produce 87-octane aviation fuel, and even that in quantities insufficient for operational needs. The nation's entire petroleum industry had been crippled by American submarine warfare. The refineries in the Dutch East Indies, captured in 1942 with such optimism, were now cut off by American control of the seas. Tankers attempting to bring oil to Japan were sent to the bottom with ruthless efficiency. The Japanese aviation industry had resorted to using lower and lower grade fuels, mixing in additives, experimenting with alcohol blends, anything to keep aircraft flying. Pilots reported engines that sputtered and died, aircraft that could not reach operational altitude, fighters that shook themselves apart under full throttle because the fuel detonated in the cylinders rather than burning smoothly. And now Nakamura understood why. The Americans were not just flying better aircraft. They were flying aircraft that ran on fuel Japan could not make. The difference between 87-octane and 100-octane fuel is not merely 13 points on a technical scale. It is the difference between a fuel that detonates under pressure and one that burns controllably even under the extreme conditions inside a high-performance engine. Higher octane fuel allows higher compression ratios, which means more power from the same displacement. It allows supercharging and turbocharging, forcing more air into the cylinders, extracting more energy from every drop of fuel. It allows an engine to run at higher temperatures and higher pressures without destroying itself. The Merlin engine in the Mustang was designed around the assumption of 100-octane fuel. Running it on 87-octane would be like trying to feed a thoroughbred racehorse on grass and water. It might survive, but it would never run at its potential. More likely, it would destroy itself trying. Nakamura ordered tests. They drained the American fuel from the Mustang's tanks, precious liquid gold that they stored in sealed containers like a sacred substance. They filled the tanks with the best aviation fuel Japan could provide. They mounted the aircraft on a static test stand, chalked the wheels, and prepared to run the engine. The test pilot, a veteran named Lieutenant Yamada who had somehow survived 3 years of combat, climbed into the cockpit. Nakamura stood at a safe distance with his clipboard and stopwatch. The Merlin engine coughed to life, its 12 cylinders firing with a sound like controlled thunder. For 30 seconds, everything seemed fine. Then the engine note changed, becoming rougher, more uneven. Black smoke began streaming from the exhaust stacks. Inside the cockpit, Yamada watched the cylinder head temperature gauge climb into the red zone. He advanced the throttle to combat power. The engine responded for a moment, then began to shudder violently. The sound changed from a roar to a harsh, rattling noise, the sound of premature detonation, of fuel exploding rather than burning, of metal components being hammered by forces they were never designed to endure. Yamada cut the throttle and shut down the engine. In the sudden silence, Nakamura could hear his own heartbeat. The post-test inspection revealed what he had feared. The engine had suffered damage to the piston crowns and cylinder walls after less than 3 minutes of operation on Japanese fuel. The supercharger had been unable to deliver its designed boost pressure because the fuel detonated under compression. Maximum power output had been perhaps 60% of the engine's rated capacity. Maximum sustainable altitude would be severely limited. Range would be reduced. Performance would be degraded in every measurable way. They had a Mustang. They did not have the fuel to fly it as a Mustang. They had a thoroughbred fighter forced to run on peasant rations, and it was tearing itself apart from the inside. The implications cascaded through Nakamura's mind like falling dominoes. Even if Japan could manufacture copies of the Mustang's airframe, which would require aluminum alloys in quantities the nation no longer possessed, and machine tools working to tolerances Japanese factories could barely achieve, they could not make those aircraft perform as the Americans did. Japanese Mustangs would be slower, climb more poorly, fly for shorter ranges, and reach lower altitudes. They would be imitations in name only, no match for the real thing. But the problem went deeper than one aircraft type. Every advanced American fighter, the Corsair, the Hellcat, the P-47 Thunderbolt, was designed around high-octane fuel. The gulf between American and Japanese aviation was not merely a matter of design or skill. It was a gulf of resources, of industrial chemistry, of a petroleum industry capable of refining complex hydrocarbon chains into high-performance fuels in quantities measured in millions of barrels. The American petroleum industry in 1945 was producing over 4 million barrels of crude oil per day, a number so vast that Japanese economists had trouble comprehending it. The United States possessed proven oil reserves exceeding 20 billion barrels. Its refinery capacity dwarfed Japan's by orders of magnitude. American chemical engineers had spent the 1930s perfecting catalytic cracking, polymerization, and alkylation processes that could take low-grade crude oil and transform it into high-octane aviation fuel. The addition of tetraethyl lead as an anti-knock additive had pushed octane ratings even higher. During the war years, American refineries had operated at maximum capacity, feeding an air force that consumed aviation fuel at rates that would have drained Japan's total production in a matter of weeks. The fuel that Nakamura had drained from the Mustang's tanks and stored like a holy relic represented perhaps 6 hours of production from a single American refinery. To the Americans, it was consumable. To Japan, it was irreplaceable. Nakamura wrote his report to Naval High Command with the careful language of a man delivering terrible news to superiors who do not wish to hear it. He documented the Mustang's capabilities in clinical detail. He described the engineering excellence of its design. He listed the materials and manufacturing processes required for reproduction. And then, in a section he knew would be read with anger and disbelief, he explained that possession of the Mustang's design was meaningless without possession of the industrial infrastructure to support it. Japan could no more build effective Mustangs than it could build effective B-29s or effective anything else that required resources the nation no longer possessed. The war had already been lost. The Americans had not defeated Japan through superior courage or tactics. They had defeated Japan through superior chemistry and logistics. The engineers had expected to find secrets in the Mustang, some brilliant innovation, some clever design that would reveal itself under study and provide Japan with a path to competitive parity. What they found instead was something more demoralizing: confirmation that American superiority was not a matter of secrets, but of scale. The Mustang was an excellent design, but it was not a miraculous one. Any competent aeronautical engineer could understand its principles. But understanding and replicating are different things. The Mustang was the product of an industrial system that could afford to machine components to unnecessary precision, because machine tools and skilled labor were abundant. It was designed with redundant systems because reliability mattered more than weight savings. It used aluminum alloys and high-grade steel because America had access to the entire planet's mineral resources. It burned 100-octane fuel because American refineries could produce it faster than American pilots could consume it. Every aspect of the Mustang assumed abundance. Japan had built its entire military philosophy on the assumption of scarcity, on making do with less, on compensating for material shortages with spiritual strength and warrior determination. The Mustang represented the opposite philosophy, overwhelming material strength that made spiritual determination irrelevant. There is a particular despair that comes from recognizing the impossibility of a task while being required to attempt it anyway. Nakamura and his team continued their work because orders were orders, because duty demanded it, because the alternative was to admit defeat explicitly rather than letting it remain implicit. They created detailed plans for a Japanese fighter incorporating Mustang design principles. They specified materials that Japan could theoretically produce. They designed around the limitations of Japanese manufacturing capacity. They created on paper an aircraft that might have been competitive in 1942 but was obsolete in 1945. And through it all, they knew the truth. The fuel problem was unsolvable. Japan could not refine high-octane aviation gasoline in the quantities needed. The petroleum simply did not exist within Japan's shrinking sphere of control. The chemistry and refining infrastructure could not be built in time. The war would end, was already ending, before Japanese pilots could fly Japanese fighters on American-quality fuel. In the hangar, the Mustang sat under its tarp like an accusation. Nakamura sometimes came to look at it late at night when the facility was quiet, and he could think without interruption. He would run his hand along the fuselage and think about the American pilot who had flown it, probably some 20-year-old from Kansas or California, trained in 6 months, flying an aircraft that represented thousands of hours of engineering work and millions of dollars of industrial output. That pilot had probably thought of this Mustang as just another aircraft, one of thousands identical to it, replaceable if lost, unremarkable in its excellence. He had probably climbed into the cockpit assuming the fuel tanks would be full, the engine would start reliably, the aircraft would perform as designed. He had probably never wondered whether the fuel was adequate, or the materials were scarce, or the industrial base was sufficient. To him, those questions would have seemed absurd. Of course the fuel was adequate. Of course the materials were available. He was American. Abundance was assumed. The symbolic weight of the fuel problem extended beyond mere technical considerations. Fuel, in the context of industrialized warfare, represents the lifeblood of military power, not just the literal petroleum that powers vehicles and aircraft, but the entire chain of extraction, refinement, transportation, and distribution that transforms raw crude oil into usable energy at the point of need. Control of fuel sources had shaped the entire Pacific War from its inception. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in part because of American oil embargoes that threatened to strangle the Japanese military machine. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies had been motivated primarily by the need to secure petroleum resources. The subsequent loss of those resources to American submarine interdiction had effectively doomed Japan's ability to wage modern war. By 1945, Japanese fighters were being fueled with pine root oil and other desperate substitutes. Trucks were being converted to run on wood gas generators. Civilians were being told to plant castor beans for oil production. The nation was quite literally running out of energy, and with it the ability to resist. The Americans, meanwhile, operated from a position of almost incomprehensible petroleum abundance. American tankers moved fuel across the Pacific in convoy systems protected by overwhelming naval power. American air bases in the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa received fuel shipments that would have powered Japan's entire air force for months. American pilots flew training missions that consumed more fuel than Japanese pilots would use in their entire combat careers. The fuel flowed continuously, an endless river of refined petroleum that powered not just aircraft but the entire American war machine. The ships, the trucks, the tanks, the generators, the industrial plants that produced more weapons and more fuel in a cycle that seemed to have no limits. To Japanese observers who understood the mathematics of industrial warfare, this abundance was more terrifying than American weapons. Weapons could be countered with tactics, with courage, with sacrifice. Abundance could not be countered. It could only be endured until it crushed all resistance through sheer overwhelming presence. Nakamura's team produced their final report in July 1945. It was a masterpiece of technical documentation and a eulogy for Japanese aviation. They had successfully reverse-engineered the Mustang. They understood every aspect of its design. They could, in theory, produce Japanese copies, but those copies would be inferior in every measurable way, and the primary cause of that inferiority was fuel quality. The report contained detailed calculations showing that Japanese fighters, even if perfectly designed and manufactured, could not match American performance while running on 87-octane fuel. Altitude performance would suffer. Engine reliability would decrease. Maximum speed would be reduced. Range would be shortened. In head-to-head combat, American Mustangs running on 100-octane fuel would dominate Japanese copies running on inferior fuel, even if both aircraft were mechanically identical. The Americans had won the war in the petroleum refineries of Texas and California before a single shot was fired in the Pacific. The report was never implemented. On August 6, 1945, the world entered the atomic age over Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Between these events, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, crushing the Japanese Kwantung Army in a matter of days. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio for the first time in history, announcing Japan's surrender in language that avoided the word surrender, while making the reality inescapable. The war was over. The Mustang in Hangar 7 became a historical curiosity, rather than a blueprint for impossible copies. Nakamura and his team were disbanded. Some would go on to work in Japan's post-war aviation industry, helping to rebuild and eventually create aircraft companies that would compete in global markets. But in August 1945, they simply went home, carrying with them the knowledge that they had been defeated not by any failure of skill or courage, but by the simple mathematics of industrial capacity and resource availability. The Mustang itself eventually ended up in American hands after the occupation began. It was likely scrapped or returned to U.S. inventory, just another piece of military hardware in an age when military hardware was being produced and discarded in quantities that would have seemed insane to pre-war military planners. The Americans never knew that Japanese engineers had tried to copy their fighter and failed not because of any security the design represented, but because the design assumed an industrial world the Japanese simply did not inhabit. The irony would have been lost on them in any case. To American military planners, adequate fuel was not an advantage. It was baseline reality, the foundation on which all other capabilities were built. Decades later, historians examining Japanese wartime aviation would identify fuel quality as one of the critical factors in Japan's defeat. The inability to produce high-octane aviation gasoline limited not just the Mustang replication project, but every aspect of Japanese air operations. Japanese fighters of all types suffered performance degradation as fuel quality declined throughout the war. Pilots reported that even the Zero, once the terror of the Pacific skies, had become sluggish and unreliable as fuel stocks dwindled and were replaced with inferior substitutes. The famous maneuverability of Japanese fighters had been achieved partly through lightweight construction, but also through engines that could extract maximum power from their displacement, power that required adequate fuel to realize. As fuel quality dropped, so did performance, creating a downward spiral from which there was no recovery. By war's end, Japanese aircraft were sometimes so degraded in performance that American pilots reported their opponents seemed to be flying in slow motion, almost helpless targets for American fighters that maintained peak performance on endless supplies of high-grade fuel. The lesson the Mustang taught Nakamura and his team was one that extended far beyond aviation engineering. Modern industrial warfare is not a contest of individual weapons or individual soldiers. It is a contest of industrial systems, of the ability to produce, refine, manufacture, transport, and sustain military forces across vast distances and through extended time periods. Japan had entered the war with excellent ships, excellent aircraft, and excellent pilots. But Japan had entered the war without an industrial base capable of sustaining those forces, or replacing losses, or adapting to technological evolution. The United States had entered the war with adequate ships, adequate aircraft, and adequate pilots, and with an industrial base capable of producing all of those things in quantities that Japan could not begin to match. By 1945, American adequacy multiplied by American abundance had created overwhelming superiority. The Mustang was merely one symbol of that transformation. But it was a powerful symbol, an aircraft so advanced that Japanese engineers could understand it completely and still could not replicate it, because understanding is not the same as capability. In the quiet nights after the war, Nakamura sometimes thought about the American pilot whose Mustang he had studied. He wondered if that young man had survived the war, if he had returned home to Kansas or California, if he had ever thought about the aircraft he had been forced to abandon over Iwo Jima. He wondered if that pilot had any idea that Japanese engineers had studied his aircraft with desperate intensity, searching for secrets that did not exist, trying to bridge a gap that could not be bridged. Probably not. To that American pilot, if he had survived, the Mustang had been just a tool, one of thousands of identical tools provided to him by an industrial system so vast that individual aircraft were essentially disposable. The pilot had probably flown other Mustangs before and after, had probably thought of them as no more remarkable than a carpenter thinks of a hammer. That was the final lesson of the Mustang project. The Americans had defeated Japan not through any great brilliance or innovation, but through the casual assumption of abundance. They had built an entire military machine around the idea that resources were unlimited, that losses could be replaced, that quality could be maintained at scale. They had designed fighters assuming high-octane fuel would always be available, had trained pilots assuming aircraft would always be available, had planned operations assuming ammunition, and parts and food and everything else would always be available, and those assumptions had proven correct. America had possessed the industrial capacity to make abundance reality, to turn assumptions into actual fuel flowing into actual tanks, to maintain a supply chain across an ocean that would have seemed impossible to military planners of an earlier generation. Japan had built its military philosophy on different assumptions of scarcity, of making do with less, of compensating for material shortages through fighting spirit and tactical brilliance. Those assumptions had proven catastrophically wrong in the context of industrial warfare. Spirit and brilliance had not mattered against an enemy who could afford to train pilots to just adequate proficiency and then equip them with aircraft so superior that modest skill was sufficient for victory. Tactical innovation had not mattered against an enemy who could afford to learn from mistakes and correct them with new equipment produced in overwhelming quantities. Courage had not mattered against an enemy who never ran out of ammunition or fuel or replacement aircraft. The Mustang sat in that hangar for less than 6 months, but it taught a lesson that would shape Japan's post-war development. The nation that rebuilt from the ashes of 1945 would be a nation that understood the importance of industrial infrastructure, of resource security, of building economic systems capable of sustaining advanced technology. Japan would never again enter a conflict assuming that spirit could compensate for material shortfalls. The engineers who had studied the Mustang would become leaders in post-war industry, building companies that would eventually produce aircraft and automobiles and electronics competitive with anything in the world, but they would do so with constant awareness of resource limitations, of the need to secure supply chains, of the vulnerability that comes from dependence on external sources for critical materials. The lesson was learned, but the learning had cost millions of lives in the destruction of a nation. In the end, the Mustang was more than an aircraft. It was a messenger from the future, arriving in Japan in early 1945 to deliver news that the war was already over, that the outcome had been determined by factors beyond Japanese control, that industrial capacity had become destiny in the modern world. The Japanese engineers who studied it had hoped to find secrets they could use to change the war's trajectory. Instead, they found confirmation that the war had been lost before it began, that Japan had challenged an opponent whose resources and industrial power were simply incommensurable with Japanese capabilities. They had tried to match the Mustang and discovered they lacked not just the fuel to fly it, but the entire industrial ecosystem that made such fuel, and such aircraft, and such military power possible. The spring cherry blossoms bloomed around Kasumigaura Naval Air Arsenal in April 1945, as they had every year for centuries, beautiful and indifferent to human conflict. Nakamura walked between the trees one evening after a long day of futile work, trying to find some peace in the eternal cycle of nature. But even the cherry blossoms reminded him of the war. Their beauty was fleeting, lasting only days before the petals fell and scattered. Japan had believed its own power was like the cherry blossom, beautiful in its perfection, glorious even in its brevity, symbolizing a warrior culture that valued quality over longevity. America's power was different. Not the cherry blossom, but the entire forest, vast and enduring, built on foundations of resource abundance that seemed almost geological in their permanence. You could not defeat a forest by being more beautiful than a single tree, and Japan had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, through years of grinding attrition that ended in firebombing and atomic weapons and surrender. The Mustang had been just one aircraft, and its story had been just one small episode in a vast war. But small episodes often contain larger truths. The truth the Mustang carried in its fuel tanks, literal and metaphorical, was that modern warfare had become industrialized beyond the capacity of traditional military virtues to overcome. Courage and skill and tactical brilliance still mattered, but they mattered within constraints set by industrial capacity and resource availability. An outnumbered, outgunned, underfueled military could not prevail through spirit alone against an opponent who possessed overwhelming material superiority and the industrial capacity to sustain it indefinitely. That was the message Japanese engineers had read in every rivet of the Mustang's aluminum skin, in every precision machined component of its Merlin engine, and most especially in the specifications for fuel their nation could not produce. The war had ended not with a dramatic defeat in some climactic battle, but with the slow realization that the mathematics of industrial warfare admitted no possible Japanese victory. The Mustang had been one small piece of that realization, one silver messenger delivering one part of an unbearable truth. And so the engineers had gone home, and the war had ended, and the Mustang had disappeared into history, one aircraft among thousands, barely remembered in the vast catalog of World War II aviation. But for the men who had studied it in those desperate months of early 1945, it remained unforgettable, the beautiful, impossible fighter that had shown them the limits of their nation's power and the true nature of the enemy they had challenged. They had tried to match it and failed, not through any lack of skill or determination, but because they had discovered too late that they had been trying to fight a different kind of war than the one that was actually being waged. They had brought swords to an industrial furnace. They had brought spiritual strength to a contest of petroleum chemistry. They had brought warrior courage to an equation that could only be solved with millions of barrels of high-octane fuel and the refinery capacity to produce them. And they had lost, as perhaps they always had to lose, the moment they challenged an opponent whose power was measured not in the quality of its weapons, but in the bottomless depth of its resources. The hangar stands empty now, if it still stands at all. The Mustang is long gone. The engineers have passed into history, but the lesson remains, written in the invisible ink of high-octane fuel and industrial capacity, that wars in the modern age are won not by those who fight best, but by those who can afford to keep fighting longest, who possess the resources and industrial power to sustain warfare across years and continents and oceans. Japan learned that lesson over cities burned to ash and harbors filled with sunken ships. The Mustang was just one teacher among many. But sometimes a single perfect example can illuminate a truth more clearly than volumes of statistics. And the Mustang, sitting in that hangar with Japanese engineers measuring its every dimension while knowing they could never truly copy it, had been as perfect an example as history ever provides. Beautiful, terrible, and impossible. A silver ghost from an industrial future that Japan had challenged and lost the right to inhabit.